the early 1900s, Britain had one of the most powerful navies in the world, protecting her interests at home and throughout the empire. Flying was seen as nothing more than a rich man's sport and of no interest to the navy. Besides, the English Channel was the finest form of natural defence. Then, in June 1909, Louis Blériot took around 40 minutes to fly across the Channel in an aeroplane he had designed and built himself. Now the Royal Navy, and indeed the Army, began to take notice. Naval concerns were to be increased by the development of the submarine. They called it underhand, unfair, and un-English. But the submarine was here to stay. Then it was realized that it was easier to spot a submarine from the air than from sea level. Soon, a number of naval officers were learning to fly. In 1911, the first naval flying school opened. The Army had also begun to see military uses for aircraft, and in 1912 the Naval and Army flying units were combined to form the Royal Flying Corps. The idea was to cut the cost of training and equipment, but the services couldn't agree on who did what, nor which aircraft they should be using, or how pilots should be trained.
And as a seaplane pilot, one had to be very much better trained in navigation and in various other requirements related to the water. Having said that, I can only say that I did enjoy flying seaplanes and spent most of my time flying over the southern North Sea. Navigation, of course, was essential because very quickly after one became airborne, one was out of sight of land or any sea marks. So the use of compass bearings and timing and wind direction were vital to plotting your course and getting home eventually.
Within 2 years, the Admiralty had created its own Air Force, the Royal Naval Air Service. As a result, when the First World War broke out, Britain had not only one, but 2 air services. During the first years of the war, the Navy searched hard for a role for its aircraft. At first, recognizing that Britain's ports could be vulnerable to attack by airships, they felt they needed the protection of fighters. But the first German Zeppelin raids of the war proved that the aircraft of the time just couldn't fly high enough to attack the Zeppelins. So the RNAS began to look at ways of turning its aircraft into bombers, to attack the Zeppelins in their sheds and prevent them ever getting airborne. To do the job properly, however, a new aircraft was needed, one that could carry a big enough payload of bombs. The Handley Page 0100 and later the 0400 provided the solution.
The Handley Page came along and increased the scope for night bombing enormously. It could carry more bombs, for one thing. Needed more crew, needed a crew of 4 as a minimum, but it was a big, stable aeroplane, and as there wasn't very much effective defense, people got away with it by flying Handley Pages.
But many people wondered whether bombing targets well inside Germany was really practical, or, considering the likely civilian casualties that would result, desirable. 2 years later, in 1917, Germany resumed her bombing campaign against London, this time using her own long-range bombers, and the moral doubts about bombing were swept aside in a tidal wave of public outcry. Within months, the 2 services were merged into one independent force, and on April the 1st, 1918, the Royal Air Force was born. At a stroke, the Navy lost control of nearly 3,000 aircraft, plus 55,000 officers and naval ratings. They were left with only their shipborne aircraft, and even these were to go to the RAF 2 years later. For almost 20 years, the Navy made repeated attempts to regain control over their aircraft. They seemed to be getting somewhere in 1924, when the Fleet Air Arm of the RAF was formed. It was agreed that so-called fleet flights, normally controlled by the RAF, would be given over to the Navy when they were flown from aircraft carriers. Apart from this, maritime aviation suffered from government underfunding, always losing out to the bombers. There were, of course, some new maritime aircraft. Manufacturers, who had developed a relationship with the Navy during the war, continued to build for the RAF, although in much smaller numbers. The Supermarine Southampton virtually saved the concept of the flying boat from extinction after a number of expensive failures.
To get out on the wing and put a starting handle into a cog as you did ancient motor cars and turn it round to start up the engines, then climb back aboard again, and open cockpits too in the Southampton. Yeah, fine, solid aeroplane.
Its day-to-day role was reconnaissance of Britain's coastline, but it was most famous for its long-distance flights. In 1927, 4 Southamptons went on a flag-waving 27,000-mile trip around the Mediterranean and the Far East. Blackburn was another major supplier of flying boats. The Iris was an enormous 3-engine flying boat with a range of up to 500 miles. It had all the comforts of home, with sleeping accommodation, kitchen, and canteen for the crew, while on long-range reconnaissance missions. Blackburn also built a number of land- or carrier-based torpedo bombers for the fleet flights. The Dart was the first, entering service in 1923. Its top speed was only 107 miles an hour, but its landing speed of around 38 miles an hour made it a natural choice for aircraft carrier use. The Ripon, introduced in 1929, was the natural successor to the Dart, and it set the standard for British torpedo bombers until the arrival of the Beaufort in 1939. The poor level of maritime development can be seen by the fact that the Fairey Swordfish, which became the Fleet Air Arm standard torpedo bomber of the Second World War, had a performance little better than that of the Ripon. In 1934, Winston Churchill warned of the growing power of Hitler's Germany, and finally defense expenditure began to increase. But as priorities moved backwards and forwards between bombers and fighters, naval requirements tended to get lost in the rush. In 1936, as part of a wholesale restructuring of RAF organization, the old coastal area was renamed Coastal Command. Only one area saw any expansion, and that was the Fleet Air Arm. The rest of the command had to struggle on with its obsolete biplanes. Indeed, the last biplane flying boat, the Supermarine Stranraer, didn't come into service until the following year.
I was very fond of the Stranraer, actually. Really good aeroplane, very, very solid, and I took the squadron out for cruises. We used to do what we called a med cruise. We used to go out to land at Lisbon, which is a bit hairy, as a matter of fact, because the Tagus seems to run very fast, and the buoys we had to tie up to were large metal ones, not the rather nice rubber ones which we've been used to. And if you had made a mistake on approaching your metal buoy, you could either take your float off or take a wing off or do a lot of damage.
In 1937, the Royal Navy had one final go at taking over the Fleet Air Arm. This time, they won. RAF Coastal Command was left with only the land-based squadrons and a few flying boats at their disposal. The theory behind the virtual starvation of Coastal Command's development was that German surface ships seen as the principal threat could be dealt with by the Navy.